So we'll start by setting our motivation. We try to generate those minds of confidence in the Buddha's wisdom, in the power of the Lamrim to be our guide, on the basis of our understanding that the Buddha, his teachings, and the community of practitioners who deeply understand his teachings, like Lama Tsongkhapa, the great masters, they have set out this path, this unmistaken, powerful, effective path for our own practice, our own lives. And that it culminates reliably, repeatably in the state of enlightenment. Which is something that we seek not for our own benefit, but rather to be of benefit. To be of perfect, limitless benefit to sentient beings. So we develop these minds of faith and refuge and bodhicitta as our motivation. All right, and with that motivation, we'll turn back to the material. Any questions from previous material in this section? Right. So we are then on day 218. And this quotation, there is nobody to share our journey or our destination, from Lama Zopa is the quotation for day 218. And it's a teaching on, as some of the other, there's really three lists that I'm aware of on the sufferings, the list of 3, the list of 6, and the list of 8 sufferings. And this is a teaching on, in one place in the commentary, he calls it not having helpers, the suffering of not having helpers. In other places, they call it being friendless, is the kind of the other translation, I guess, of the Tibetan. So, of course, what's kind of absent from the commentary is the fact that it is also true that, of course, enlightened beings exist and enlightened activity exists. But this is what this is getting at, really isn't that truth, but the kind of more ordinary truth of the impact that ordinary sentient beings can or cannot have. And of course, even aside from enlightened beings, there are Arya beings, there are even great bodhisattvas, maybe Arya bodhisattvas or bodhisattvas before the path of seeing, so of course, there are in some ways, exceptions to this idea in general, but so it isn't truly getting at the fact that there are no beneficial forces of any kind within reality. That's not kind of what's being said. But what is being said is more so that our lives, this life, our previous lives, this life, our future lives, they play out under the influence of karma and delusion. And that process is something that we create through our own actions, we purify through our own actions, and that we experience through the content of our own mind. And so, in a way, we have to really take a great deal of responsibility for that process. No one, not even, of course, the Buddhas or Bodhisattvas or Arya Bodhisattvas, can directly change our karma, can directly force us to create positive karma, or can remove negative karma. All the famous quotation, the Buddhas can only point the way. They can only show us what we ought to adopt, or what we ought to adopt or discard. But we are free to either do that or not do that. And the results of that are individual. And then, of course, it's also pointed out that the death process, because it says here, our journey or our destination, and the destination kind of is referring to the death process and the throwing karma of the next life. Sorry, I'm having to clear my throat a lot. So as we experience our death, of course, we might be surrounded. And again, still, there are beneficial things that we can and ought to try to do to establish a peaceful environment and so on. But, our senses, at some point in that process, the sound of mantra, the sound of, won't be accessible to us, because our mind will have absorbed beyond the point where whatever we've put in the environment that is pleasant, supportive, is no longer accessible to the mind. And that mind yet still exists and is still transitioning through the death process. And then the mind will fully exit the body and enter the intermediate state. And then here again, too, of course, there's still some effect of enlightened beings and the power of prayer and so on. But if we don't create those, connections, if we don't generate the ability to, have that sort of connection to enlightened energy through training and through practice, then that's going to reduce the effectiveness of that sort of thing. The more that we can do from our side to clear away the obscurations, the things, the veils of ignorance and so on, then the more benefit we would receive from enlightened activity. And that's entirely up to what we're capable of doing. So. Yeah.
Excuse me,
Yep.
Venerable Andrew, when you just said that of the enlightened activity, are you talking about in the dying process, that there can be enlightening enlightened activity. I'm only wondering, I guess it depends on the level of where your mind is at the time, but there's a particular sadhana, and at the end of it, it says, with with the voices, with the sounds of voices and of symbols, with the sound of symbols and voices and so forth from heroes and heroines. And I'm just wondering if that's part of your death process, that you're surrounded by that, if your practice has been such that your mind can cognize that. What's cognizing that?
Yeah. So in general, as I understand, heroes and heroines is an English translation of dakas and dakinis. Um, so those are not, here again, this, really is focusing on more so the ordinary sentient beings. And again, kind of just not including any sort of the more esoteric and, kind of that aspect of what is also true about reality. This is kind of talking about, our friends, our family, and so on. And even the sort of messenger dakas and dakinis and things, it's still, and of course there's prayers that say, also too, may I see Amitabha, during the, but again, all of that really does depend on our mind, because if it didn't, then, I mean, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and so on, they have perfect compassion, they have perfect omniscience, omnipotence to the extent, because in Buddhism, omnipotence means something a little bit different than it does like in the Christian tradition, where when God is considered to be omnipotent, that kind of means there is nothing beyond the capacity of God. But the Buddhists have limits. Omnipotence in the Buddhist sense means able to do anything that can be done. But there are things that can't be done. Buddhas can't create minds, they can't create places, other than Pure Lands. I mean, they can't make world systems for ordinary people that, are designed in a particular way. There are Pure Lands that are manifestations of enlightened mind, but they can't make an earth that's just like a place you can go ordinarily and you don't have to do anything, you just go there and things are better. Things like that. They don't have the power of creation in that way, and they don't have the power to just at the snap of their fingers fully change. They can help to activate positive karma, but that positive karma has to already be a seed that exists in that person's mind stream. They can't establish that positive karma. They can help to activate it. They can help to create the causes and the conditions to cause that to ripen. But the karmic seed itself has to already be present. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, so then that kind of ends the 6 sufferings, I believe, that are included here. The 6. Pull up that list. So the 6 sufferings again are indefiniteness, dissatisfaction, probably not a word, indefiniteness, dissatisfaction, abandoning one's body again and again, taking rebirth again and again, moving constantly between high and low, meaning sometimes we're in the upper realms, sometimes we're in the lower realms. And then the sixth is what we just covered, being friendless, or lacking helpers. So now, day 219, the quotation from Lama Zopa is, samsara might look attractive on the outside, but we need to see the poison that lies within. So he says, when we meditate on the 6 types of suffering, which again, we just finished looking at the 6, he says it's important to draw a firm conclusion, seeing that nothing is definite in samsara, that nothing has the ability to give us satisfaction, and that due to not realizing this, we jump from one samsaric body to another endlessly. We must make the determination to do whatever we can to break this cycle. So he's kind of showing the connections, the linkages between the 6 sufferings. That because, that indefiniteness gives rise to dissatisfaction, and that dissatisfaction, causes that craving and grasping is what activates, we said that another way of thinking about dissatisfaction is craving and grasping. And then that, when craving and grasping is present in the mind, it's going to activate karma that's going to, at the time of death, impel without choice another ordinary samsaric rebirth. So, and then within all of those rebirths, of course, we are, as we just said, in kind of an ordinary sense, considered to be friendless. He says we need both a firm intellectual understanding based on in-depth study of the Lamrim, and a strong meditative practice that takes our understanding beyond the intellectual to actual experience. As we progress, we will find that our understanding enhances our meditation, and our meditation enhances our understanding. So this is getting at, those 2 parts of any analytical meditation, where you have the analysis and then the stabilizing the part. So the analysis is meant to give rise to what he's saying, this kind of heartfelt insight, this kind of, I've always used the word visceral. I don't think I'm the first. I probably just don't remember who I heard it from, but I've always liked visceral in the sense of what analytical meditation is meant to give rise to, regardless of the topic, regardless of what is being analyzed. What the point of the analysis is to give rise to this deeply felt insight that is not, as he says, just dry intellectual knowledge, but is actually some sort. And of course, as he says, also, there's repetition, there's this sort of feedback between the 2 processes of study and meditation. And so it's something, with respect to any topic, it's something that deepens. The way that the insight dawns in the mind is something that over the years, changes and deepens and becomes, something more over time. But still, that's the kind of theory of formal practice, is that it is really the visceral insight, when we focus our attention on it, and we repeat that experience many times over many years, it changes the mind fundamentally at some point. So then he talks about the kind of the false promise of cyclic existence, samsara, that he says, for one, that, maybe relationships, all of the ways that we kind of deceive ourselves, the ways that we think relationships can be stable, permanent, satisfactory, that possessions can give rise to lasting happiness, reliance on the body as a source of sensory pleasure. He says we need to see that trap for what it is and not be deceived. That when the friend becomes enemy, when possessions let us down, and when it is time to leave the body, we will cope without worry or fear. So, what he's saying is that the Buddha isn't just trying to get us to see something in a fabricated way. The Buddha is just describing what's true about our experience, and it's uncomfortable. And because it's just sort of like when we talked about the topic of death and impermanence, it isn't that the Buddha is trying to frighten us, in a made up unnecessary way. Just like in the same way, you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, you should really stop smoking because consistently, reliably, it causes cancer in a majority of people who, have a habit that's like yours. And that there's facts, there's data, there's truth behind what's being said. And your doctor is concerned for your health and is giving you good advice. And the Buddha is doing the same. The Buddha is saying, this is true about reality. And so here's good advice about how to prepare the mind, because if we, just like when we talked about impermanence is something that will assert itself, whether or not we want to train the mind to be prepared for it. We will be confronted with it, and here Lama Zopa is saying we will be confronted with our friends letting us down, our possessions letting us down, our body letting us down. And it's up, we can choose not to be prepared for that, but because it is an unavoidable aspect of reality, either we suffer unnecessarily when confronted, or we prepare the mind ahead of time, and then we navigate that more skillfully.
I think it's, at least in my mind, the last sentence is the most encouraging. It doesn't bring fear about death, or it doesn't bring fear. It seems very encouraging to me to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, when we recognize that there is that happiness, of course, as the Buddha says, happiness comes from within. Do not seek it without, meaning from outside of oneself, outside of the mind, outside of the states of mind that are actually correlated with joy and so on. That if and when we rely on anything other than the actual mental states that are responsible, that are meaningfully correlated with joy and so on, then we are labeling suffering as happiness because it seems like, well, just comparatively, it's better than anything else in this realm of external things. And so sort of picking from the best sources of external things, if we decide that that is the best we can do, that that's all we can do, then we're incredibly limited because it's an unworkable system. It's not a reliable system. And if that's our system, we'll be disappointed. We'll meet with frustration and pain. But if we label that correctly and we see that it's all the suffering of change, then we reorient and we have the time and the space to work on the mind and establish the actual, because it isn't like Buddhism says there are no actual sources of happiness. If that was true, that would be a real bummer. That's not true. The Buddha's just saying these are not the real sources of happiness, but these other things, they really are. And so, we're just giving ourselves the time and the space to stop doing what doesn't work and to instead do what does work. And then we get the benefits of doing what does work. And then, like, as you're saying, that person is not depending on things that are unreliable and so on. They're not seeing the suffering of change as genuine happiness. They're not deceived in that way. And so when they are confronted with the fact that those things really are unreliable, it doesn't matter, because they weren't relying on them to be otherwise. They understood their nature. And that doesn't mean that you can't enjoy those things for what they are in that moment, but you understand the limitations of the food and the drink and whatever. And so you can interact with it on the level on which there's some pleasant feelings, but then you don't have that greediness, that attached craving and grasping, where when that recedes and something else begins to happen, that like, oh no, I need this to start happening again, and I can't tolerate that this is no longer happening. The mind is just in tune with what is true, and it's not being tricked by only pursuing those things and only looking at those things as the source of our happiness. Just saying, oh yeah, if there is this thing that I enjoy, then great, I'll enjoy it, and then it will be gone, and that's fine too. And you know so then day 220, Lama Zopa says there is no such thing as a vacation from samsara. So, I guess a vacation, the idea there of a vacation is something that's time limited, that like you can take a break and then you can come back to it. Of course, enlightenment, is a thing, but it's permanent. It's not like, we can't think while I'm still in samsara that I can do something for some period of time that is sort of like a break from samsara. Um, and then, but of course we can achieve enlightenment, but then samsara for us, our samsara, as we've said, our samsara is ceased permanently forever at that point. So, he's pointing out here in one way that even as we've said, the general, there's there are what are called the general and the specific sufferings. So, and the general sufferings are true even of the demigod, the god, the formless realms, these places where comparatively things are, in one way of thinking, better than other places. Just like in one way of thinking, the human realm, being relatively in the upper realm, is comparatively better than the experiences that are being had in the hell realms. Comparatively, that's true, but even in the upper realms, there is still suffering compared to fully enlightened beings. And so we can't think that we will be able to take any kind of vacation. And then, of course, that also is getting at the difference between the four Arya truths and like the four ordinary truths that we've kind of as a theme been talking about throughout the module, the chapters, where for ordinary beings, they agree that suffering exists, but they only think of it as overt suffering, like poverty and famine and so on. So the solution for ordinary beings is, get a good education, make enough money, try not to become homeless, do all of the things that support wealth and status and reputation. But of course, that's a very superficial understanding compared to the Arya truths, where there's very, very subtle levels of suffering that go much deeper than those temporary overt states. So of course, he's also saying here that we might think that we can avoid suffering by just changing how much money we have, or where we live, or what our job is, or like what we can. Like some people think, oh, if I'm able to spend 3 months a year traveling around the world every year, then like I've made it, and sort of it's the best that anybody could hope for. And of course, Lama Zopa is saying that's a completely afflicted way of understanding reality, that it's just comparing one kind of ordinary experience with perhaps a less enriched kind of ordinary experience. But when you compare either of them to actual enlightenment, they're both full of incredible suffering. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? So then day 222, Lama Zopa is going to talk about the suffering of aging. So sickness, aging, and death are the three kind of primary in that. So here, this is particularly the suffering of aging. So he says, of course, although aging begins at the moment after conception. So here we've talked about before, when we talked about the section on impermanence and death, we said that the ordinary way of talking about death is, oh, that person died of a heart attack, or they died of cancer, or they died in a car accident or something. But from the Buddhist point of view, that person, that the moment that body and mind came together in the womb, that process of aging began, as he says, began the moment after conception. And so the primary cause of death is birth. And because birth is the beginning of the aging process, or you could say the impermanence of the body, and the impermanence of the body is what empowers death. If the body wasn't changing moment by moment, we wouldn't die, either through natural causes or even through an accident or violence. Because if the body couldn't change, then you could shoot the body and it would just bounce off, because the body is not changeable. The fact that the impermanence of the body also is what permits infection by viruses or bacteria or physical injury. If the body existed in an impossible way where it wasn't impermanent, then those external sources could touch the body, but the body would just continue as it was. So, but he says the suffering relates primarily to the time when we realize we're becoming old. So in this way, it's kind of, it's almost like relating the suffering of aging to the suffering of change in a way where, as a, from the time that we're like a fetus up until the point where he's pointing out here, it's almost like aging is making things better. It's in the same way that when we are agitated or bored or what have you, and we seek out a person to talk to or a movie to watch, what have you, it's as if temporarily things are getting better because we're distracted. We're I don't know, in this sense. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but it just kind of, in a way, kind of seems a bit like that, where there, um, perhaps where it falls apart as an analogy is I'm not sure what the previous state, unless you want to say like the suffering of the bardo, maybe, comparative, maybe, we put an end to the suffering of the intermediate state, and take birth. Maybe you could say that that's kind of the upswing, that when we die, things are getting worse, and maybe the intermediate state isn't so great for most people, and then things, maybe you could say, start to get better, assuming that, of course, you get. This is kind of, talking about not. This is talking mainly about the human realm here, but then also the upper realms, probably not so much the lower realms, because as you are getting closer to death, probably that's an improvement in those realms. So this is kind of talking about the suffering of aging. More so, I would think, applies to the fortunate realms, where comparatively speaking, you're not so excited to be separated from it, whereas being separated from the lower realms at death is probably the best thing that could happen. But for us, the first 20 years, 30 years, we were kind of on this perpetual upswing, in a way where we were getting more freedoms. Our body was maturing, getting stronger. We were learning more, getting more agency, more efficacy. And then he says, at some point we realize that now we're on the downslope of the curve. And, our eyesight is going to continue to decline. Our hearing is going to continue to decline. Our sense of taste, the body is going to make noises, and it's going to be difficult to get up and get down, comparatively, and that's a permanent sort of curve that it only ends in death. It doesn't start to get better again. So yeah, so that's just sort of, says, if we are not yet old, it is a very good meditation to think about what this will be like. Think about never doing anything without pain, of being too weak to pick things up or to walk more than a few paces, of being unable to see or hear clearly. Think of being utterly reliant on others for everything, for the food we eat and for being bathed and dressed. When we are old, every day is a reminder of the shortening of our life. and how we are losing more and more of our strength, vitality, sense faculties, and ability to function. So that's cheerful. Any thoughts or questions so far? So again, I think, this is just sort of being realistic, and recognizing, right now, today, my body works well enough, my mind works well enough, but I don't know how much more time I have. So I should really take the essence of what I have of every day. Okay. Day 223 is the suffering of illness. So again, sickness, aging, and death. Um, so that one, also really quite straightforward. Um, of course, there is a correlation, as he points out, between aging and sickness. And so, of course, we know that generally our immune system, doesn't get better with age. It, tends to decline with age. And so there's an increase in illness. And also cancer is, something that happens more so in old age, heart disease. These are things that take time, that are progressive. And so older people are generally more prone, but of course, illness can also strike at any time, at any age, in a variety of ways. Um, so I think it's, again, really just appreciating that, right now we're not ill, but we don't know, we could be diagnosed tomorrow with something life threatening. Um, and so, and, probably not, and hopefully it's years away, but how are we going to train the mind between now and that day to be able to to have that meeting with the doctor and hear that news, that we may have a terminal illness, or we may have something that we can get through, but it might be incredibly painful, it might be protracted. How can we prepare the mind to be calm during that? And how can we, if we recognize that also practice is only going to become more challenging with the coming decades, um, you know, how can we kind of bank our practice sort of when things are going well, and we're free from those obstacles? Because at the time of death, of course, it's the accumulated karmic seeds that are going to be relevant. And if we recognize unavoidably that that potentially, the last decade or so of our life is going to be comparatively, for most people, more difficult to go on retreat, to engage in, serious practice and so on, then we shouldn't be thinking, oh, well, I'll wait, because um, we know that things are, um, again, with aging and with sickness, those obstacles are not going to decrease. as we get older. Those are obstacles that are only going to generally increase. And so we can overcome that in a way by kind of allowing for those obstacles to be there, because we really took full advantage of all of the time that we had, rather than kind of having a false view of thinking, well, I'm busy now, later maybe I'll be less busy, and so later is better. When we recognize, well, really, probably now is the best, most obstacle-free time in terms of having a body and mind that's serviceable for practice.
The other day, I was at acupuncture and she was putting, my doctor, she was putting needles in my fingers right there in the nail. And as it was going on, I was trying to breathe, and man, I definitely need some help with that, because all of the breathing, all of the focus that I've been working on just went out the window with the pain.
Isn't that like a form of torture? Isn't that what they do to like prisoners? Like you're talking about like right there? Like I'm pretty sure that's like a war crime.
I'm pretty sure it is too, but it was right inside it went right down in between the nail and the skin. And yeah, that was torture.
Maybe find a different acupuncturist. I don't know. That sounds awful. I don't think it's supposed to hurt. I don't know. Any other thoughts or questions?
Just an observation. At this age, both Chris and I are in our 70s, and it's really obvious that by the end of the day, you do your practice in the morning, your day goes on, and by the end of the day, to do evening prayers and practice and whatever, I'm such a lump that I think, boy, had I not used my energy when I was younger to focus on this, I'd be way ahead. But it's the way it is. It's such a reminder to I guess to practice when you've got the energy, and to be glad, I guess.
All right, and the last thing that we'll cover, day 224. Lama Zopa says, life is like a play where we are born, we live our short lives, and we die. So here, this is the suffering, of course, the suffering of death, sickness, aging, and death, or in the way that it's presented here, aging, sickness, and death. So here again, like with the others, he's just pointing out that, just like sickness and just like aging, it's not dependent on what we want, or what we're prepared for, or it's just natural and unavoidable. He says the person that we have thought of as, quote, me, and have cherished for so long will cease to exist, and the subtle consciousness will leave the useless body to take another life. So it doesn't depend on what we believe or what we hope, or what we desire. It's independent of any content of the mind. And so either we can prepare for that or not. Again, like we've been saying, kind of like with anything, when we are learning to drive a car, for example, we know that it's very likely that there will come a point in our lifetime of driving where we're going to meet with a challenging, situation. There's going to be ice on the road. And so we can decide, well, yeah, that'll probably happen. Of course, here it's a little bit different because could be that there are some people, statistically speaking, maybe who could drive for 50 years and they never have any dangerous circumstances arise. But for most people, at least at some point, some dangerous circumstance is going to arise. And so it makes sense. It's logical and reasonable to think, well, I should take driving courses. I should practice. I should maybe go out when it is a little bit snowy. Instead of just avoiding that, I should drive in the snow, so that if I ever get stuck somewhere and it starts to snow, I'll know how to do that. It's kind of just the same sort of a thing. It's just being logical and being reasonable, and preparing for what happens in life. And again, we have a choice. A person can kind of roll the dice, and think, well, either that'll work out or it won't work out, but I'm not going to do anything to try to make it work out. That's open. That's an option that's open, either in terms of the mundane things in our lives or in terms of the really important spiritual things in our lives. It's open to us to choose whether we will make effort and strive to be prepared, or whether we just sort of roll the dice and see how it goes. But Lama Zopa is encouraging us to overcome those potential obstacles by really preparing the mind. He says, if we die with a negative mind, we can experience fearful karmic visions, hear terrible sounds, portents of our future, suffering overcome with terror. Our mind will still has to leave this body. This can definitely happen to us. So, he's saying the mind and the body will separate, but what karma ripens is something that we have control over. We have no control over the separation itself, but we have a good deal of control over how that process will unfold from a karmic standpoint, subjectively, internally, whether it's a positive or a negative karma. If we spend this life creating virtue, avoiding non-virtue, purifying existing non-virtue, then we're setting ourselves up for that to go well. Or like I said, it can just be like, well, we'll see what happens. And that's an option, but Lama Zopa is not encouraging us to do that. All right, that's enough for today. Any final thoughts or questions? All right, so we'll end with dedication. So we recollect our motivation, and we think that by having listened and participated, we've actualized that motivation, created positive energy in the mind, and that energy will ripen in beneficial ways. And we want that positive energy to specifically ripen in ways that support our spiritual growth, development. So think strongly and clearly about the ways in which you would like to dedicate your positive energy in a meaningful spiritual way. All right. So we will pick it up on Thursday.